With the rapid introduction of new vaccines into the marketplace and concerns about this affecting the food supply, this has you uncertain about sourcing animal-based foods. It might seem best to just avoid animal-based foods altogether, but you know this is not the ideal approach for your health. Avoiding vaccine concerns is as simple as knowing where the risk is at. Let's identify those. A growing concern, vaccines in the meat, is getting more and more attention. Rightfully so. You as the consumer should know what is in your food. Is asking for transparency too much? Well, as a health-conscious consumer, I want to give you clarity on the vaccine in your meat conversation so that you can make the choice that is right for you. But before I do, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Arland Hill. I'm a regenerative rancher that helps individuals reconnect with regeneratively raised food to improve their health in weeks, not months. Why does vaccine-free meat even matter? Well, for a couple of reasons. One, all vaccines are not the same. There's different kinds, and I'm going to go through those with you so you can just understand what is out there and has been out there for a period of time, but also what are the newer options in the marketplace. It also matters because vaccines typically come with what are known as adjuvants. And these are just ingredients that have been added to the vaccine that are stimulating an immune response. But these are also things that you're generally not going to be introducing into your body if you directly have the choice. Things like aluminum, mercury, polyethylene glycol, and other compounds that can irritate cell linings. These are all commonly found in vaccines, and you don't want those given to the animals that you're consuming any more than you want those in your body than you want them in your body any other time. There's also unproven technology that is a consideration here. So this is why it matters. We don't want to be exposing ourselves to things that haven't been fully vetted, and I'll acknowledge that this could be an arguable conversation, but it is still a conversation that warrants merit and should be further looked into. And frankly, it all boils down to transparency. If we don't have transparency when it comes to vaccines and whether or not those are in our food, and if the average consumer doesn't want those in the food, then do we really have a transparent food supply? And the short answer to that is very obviously no, we don't. Well, there's multiple types of vaccines to consider here, and I would suggest that not all of these are of equal concern. And so the types of vaccines that we're going to look at today are going to be what are known as live attenuated, and this also goes by the name of modified live. And then I'll contrast that against inactivated or killed vaccines. And the difference between these two is that your live or modified live versus your killed vaccine, your modified live is generally going to create a stronger immune response that has a greater duration of effectiveness versus a killed vaccine, which in general doesn't generate as strong of an immune response and has a shorter duration of effectiveness. But frankly, I don't think those are the ones that you're really worried about. I think the ones that you're really worried about fall under the category of mRNA vaccines. Now, before we delve off into that topic, let's also acknowledge that these are not the only classes of vaccines. There's other classes of vaccines that are out there that are used, but really where the average consumer and where I want to put our attention today is going to be around those mRNA vaccines. And I'll also note that when it comes to the live, modified, and the killed vaccines, that these have been in the marketplace for an extremely long time, for literally decades. And probably everyone that is listening to this has consumed multiple animals that have had exposure to these vaccines, and there hasn't been any risk associated with that. So we have to be honest in how we're looking at this conversation and identifying where potential risk is at. It's not going to be with modified live or killed vaccines. So the real concern goes back to the mRNA option. So from here, what we need to do is we need to break down the different species that are commonly consumed to see where you might have risk of exposure at. Well, let me also acknowledge that I'm shooting this video at the end of November 2024. And there is a possibility that the information I'm sharing with you in this video is going to change in the years to come. So be mindful about when you're watching this video. But as of right now, this isn't what I'm getting ready to share with you is accurately where we are at. In beef, mRNA vaccines are not being used in the cattle industry. If you go buy beef off the grocery store shelves or from anywhere else, you're a restaurant, a local farmer, anywhere, you're not going to find an animal that has been subjected to an mRNA vaccine. Now, that doesn't mean that mRNA vaccines for cattle don't exist. They do, but they are only in the research phase at this point, which is why I also made the comment, be mindful about when you're watching this video. But currently, mRNA vaccines do not have approval for use in the cattle industry. Well, what about when it comes to poultry? So thinking about chicken or turkeys. Well, let's be specific with chickens here for a moment. And very similar scenario in that mRNA vaccines are not currently in use. They're also in the research phase, and they're being used in the research phase for concerns around H5N1 avian flu. So that's a name that you've heard. There's different versions of this, but just think avian flu. That's something you've probably seen on the news. And so anytime I see that and knowing what has happened historically here, when we see these concerns about these different flus popping up in different species, we often see that it becomes a launching pad to rush a vaccine into the marketplace. So just know that there may be, and I'm being speculative here, and I'll acknowledge that, but history is a good indicator of how things often play out. Just acknowledge that there is a possibility that if you start hearing more about H5N1 avian flu or other versions of avian flu, that may be the trigger that pushes an mRNA vaccine into the poultry industry. But at current, there is no approval in poultry use. So if you go buy chicken, it has not been exposed to an mRNA vaccine. Now, what about pork? That's the other large category here. And this one's going to be different. This one's going to be different. This is the one you need to be paying attention to because mRNA vaccines are approved in the pork industry. In fact, the one that's out there is named Sequevity from Merck. You guys have probably heard the name Merck Pharmaceuticals. Sequevity, in their animal division, they have developed this mRNA vaccine. And it is an mRNA vaccine that is not utilized in a single virus. It can have applications in influenza virus. So for different influenza viruses that may affect pork or swine, it can be used there. There's also applications in what's called porcine circovirus, rotavirus, which affects their intestinal tract. So there's not only a limitation there's not only an application for one virus here, there's applications for multiple viruses. And this is a base that can be used to create these prescription vaccines. So it's not a traditional application of the way that we think about vaccines. And that really doesn't matter to you as the consumer. What matters is that it's in the food supply. And if you look at how this really should be used, it should be used against an accurately identified emerging threat, but that's not how it will be used. And the problem here, and this is really the crux of the issue, is that if you look at a typical time frame from inception to introduction into the industry, the food industry, the production side for a vaccine, it generally is going to be in the 5 to 10 year time frame. If you look at Sequevity as an mRNA vaccine, it was not in that same time frame. It was a much shorter time frame. So what is the necessity for rushing that to market? And I also did some research on PubMed just to see if I could find any peer-reviewed data on this, and I didn't have success in finding but one study that was looking in this direction. And so that also raises a red flag to me. Certainly, we've got to have a bigger body of evidence that is not solely corporate-generated evidence in which we're going to be using to make decisions with. You guys know as well as I do, that's a flawed philosophy, and it also is potentially putting you, the consumer, at risk without having the validity to say that there's not risk there. So I have concerns around it just based on the actions of pharmaceutical companies. It raises a red flag for them. And to be honest, their track record's not the best of recent. So, take that for all what it's worth. If you want to avoid these vaccines, really, this comes down to looking for animals that are raised in their species-appropriate environment. Because the terminology around when you're going to buy products off the shelf, you're not going to find any information about vaccines. There's nothing in the regenerative standards, in the organic standards, in the sustainable standards that speaks to vaccines. So you don't know if you're getting those, if that animal has been exposed to vaccines. Now, I told you where the risk was at, and the probability is that if you're buying locally from a regenerative, organic, or sustainable source, they're probably not giving the vaccines in the first place, but you as the consumer can't make an assumption. You need to ask the question, because it's always up to the discretion of the producer as to whether or not they want to use a vaccine. And I can tell you, I know regenerative producers that do use the modified live and the killed vaccines. It's not atypical for that to take place. So if you're even trying to avoid those, you definitely need to be asking questions of your producer. But again, like I said, those have a long track record of safety, so I wouldn't be too put off by having the animal exposed to those. But I want to share this with you because I think this is important too, is it really begs the question, can you raise animals without vaccines? Can they avoid these diseases without vaccines? And the answer is yes. And the reason I can tell you confidently that the answer is yes is that I've raised these animals for years on years now, and we've never exposed a single animal on our ranch to vaccines. We don't have our chicks vaccinated before we pick them up. We just don't have any dealings with vaccines, period. And we haven't had any issues with any diseases. And the reason we don't is because we're moving all of our animals. They're always moving. They're not staying in the same spaces all the time, which means that the risk of exposure to these organisms, to these pathogenic organisms, is pretty well nullified. They're not in crowded spaces. And if they're moving and they're not crowded, that equates to a low stress environment for that animal. And equally, we're also supporting their immune system by giving them adequate supply of nutrients, especially paying attention to their minerals to make sure that their immune systems are bolstered to the level that are going to be optimal, that if they do run into one of these species or one of these pathogens, that they can generally overcome it without much concern. So we're avoiding the actions altogether that are leading to these diseases in the first place, which kind of an aha moment. Why don't we do that across the board when it comes to all of agriculture? And maybe we could eliminate the use or at least significantly reduce the burden of these vaccines at the outset. So now that you understand the risk of vaccines in your meat, what do you know about hormones? Well, here's a video to clear up any confusion about where hormones can be found in your chicken.